Lena, Jay, thanks for joining us. So you just wrapped up a presentation here at the AAMI FDA BSI International Conference on Medical Device Standards and Regulation. There, Joe, you happy? I got the whole thing in there. That was good, wasn't it?
It's
known as ISC to members of our community. But your presentation was on unique device identifiers, and we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the current state, future state, et cetera. But first, what are they? And commonly referred to as UDIs, right?
Correct.
So what are UDIs?
So, as the name suggests, it's a way of uniquely identifying medical devices. And probably the easiest way to think about it is by analogy. So, in the U.S., you go to your grocery store and you pick something up and it has a UPC code on it. In the U.S., if you go get your pharmaceutical product, you know, your drug from the pharmacy, it's going to have an NDC, National Drug Code. And these are systems for uniquely identifying products that are used throughout the U.S. and actually internationally. At least the UPC is. And so UDI is an attempt, if you will, or the first step towards creating an identification scheme like those. It certainly has other aspects to it. It certainly builds upon some of the things that we've learned in the development of those systems. But that's what a unique device identifier is, and sometimes we talk about UDI or the UDI system, which includes not only the identifier but product master data that goes along with it. So that's what a UDI is.
And has this not always been in practice? Do these devices not all have serial numbers, or how is it different than a serial number? Say a little bit about that.
So it's actually a fantastic point. So medical devices, like most products, even if you pick up your box of Cheerios, will have, say, a lot number stamped on it or an expiration date stamped on it, along with its UPC. But those two things don't come together in an auto ID way, right? I can't scan the lot number, the expiration date of that box of Cheerios. So what UDI does is incorporate those existing production identifiers, serial numbers, lot numbers, expiration dates, manufacturing dates, for example, into the, if you will, barcode, so that once it's scanned, I collect all of that information automatically, and then I can do all sorts of very interesting things with it. So devices have had production identifiers, but they've been only really humanly visible. I can't use those really easily, incorporate those, say, into a supply chain kind of traceability system. So that is the major pivot, I would say, from a device identification standpoint.
Okay. And Lena, I know there's patches to this in the healthcare delivery setting, right? People are putting their own identifiers on machines.
Unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about the current state, or tell us a little bit more about the current state. Are we partway there, none of the way there in this sort of adoption of UDIs?
I think we've come a long way thanks to the U.S. and the FDA rollout of the UDI regulation. Prior to that, it was just, we weren't even sure it was going to come out. It took a long time, but it was really it was really beneficial for us, for I think the entire industry, when the final rule was published, and we started. Manufacturers were no longer able to doubt that it was going to happen, and they just kind of had to bite the bullet and move forward with it. And as they started to face the hurdles and address the challenges, realizing it wasn't as difficult as it had been perceived, and now the challenge is getting it adopted in the healthcare facilities, getting it used and applied in your healthcare records by practitioners, and then feeding that, closing the loop between regulation, the manufacturers, and the users, so that we can use the benefits of UDI for traceability, for recalls, and so on. Then we've got, and that's just U.S. Then we've got global, and as we have new UDI programs coming out, regulations coming out, for example, in EU, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Korea, they all have their own unique nuances, but essentially it's all the same. It's to uniquely identify your devices so that they can be traced through distribution and use, and help with the reporting. So there's a lot of commonalities, but really unique aspects of each program as well.
So essentially, different jurisdictions, Australia, Europe, others, are kind of adopting their own unique UDIs, which is going to create some problems. What are the significant differences between those different adoptions?
So it's at a high level, the IMDRF, International Medical Device Regulators Forum guidance, lays out the steps that a regulator should take, the kinds of concepts they should incorporate into their national, if you will, regulation scheme. And at a high level, regulators are following that. So, we see similar concepts. So conceptually, they're the same. The differences really come about when we get down into the details of implementation. And some of this is just a fundamental difference in the way that different countries regulate products. Some things are a device in one country and a drug in another, or vice versa. Some things aren't regulated at all. And all of these regulators have existing schemes, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but have existing systems in place for the way that they regulate products, and even in the U.S., overlaying UDI onto this. And so it's really understanding how all of that comes together, to Lena's point, not just from a regulator's perspective or a manufacturer's perspective, but sort of systemically within that country. When we move out of the U.S. into other countries, we often see where the payer is more involved than, say, in the U.S. And so, there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed from a, if you will, broader regulatory perspective as we look at some of those other countries and what they're doing to implement.
And I would just like to clarify a little bit on your question, Joe, because a UDI, if it's assigned in the U.S., it can certainly be used in other, it can be used in the EU, it can be used in Australia and in other jurisdictions, but it's all the backward stuff, the data, the information that's applied to it that may be different. The application of it in documentation and in various databases that could be different. That's not always the case. Sometimes, depending on if it's a medical device or not in a jurisdiction, you may need a different UDI, device identifier. But generally, once you assign one, you should be able to use that globally. That's the ultimate goal. We're not there yet. We know that there are issues that need to be addressed with that, but we're a lot closer than I think people think we are to that. We've got a ways to go, but there is light.
That's good to hear. I know that, in addition to slightly different UDIs, many of these jurisdictions also have databases, medical device incident databases, which are recording issues or problems with the UDIs, and with medical devices. One of the critical uses of a UDI would be to allow people to identify a pattern when there, say, a particular lot is being affected. We're seeing a problem with those. So we could do that, but that is a little bit of a challenge with the different databases and the different UDI use cases, or for want of a better word. Is that being addressed?
I think it could be addressed better. It's people are aware of it. Okay. We know that it's an issue. After our session at the ISC, I was asked a question like, is there ever a possibility in our lifetime of having a common one global database for UDI? I wish, but I don't see that happening because of the differences in regulations and the requirements for data. But I think there's opportunities to connect the data and make the databases in alignment so that they can share the similarities and commonalities. I think that in order for that to happen, there has to be a lot of work done prior to that, such as standardization of your data attributes. What format are the attributes? Is the data supplied in? The format of the database. In order to, there's a lot of big fundamental issues that need to be tackled and addressed first before we can even talk about a global or a common database.
When you talk about standardization of the data attributes and things, do you mean doing that across the board, across all of these, or is there standardization needed within the country, like within the U.S., and then you create the Rosetta Stone that pulls it all together?
I think there's a lot of opportunity. Again, maybe by analogy, one of the things that struck me when I started on this journey, which was 20 years ago, when you go to a retail a retailer, right? And you look at the amount of effort that is spent, all the work that goes on behind the scenes that make a Walmart or a Target or a CVS work. It's really an enormous amount of effort to keep product identification and product master data aligned, right? It's an enormous undertaking. And that's not quite where we are yet in the U.S. And so, standardization, what do we mean by various products? What do we mean by, Lena brought up at the conference earlier, where does the UDI go? What is the label of a medical device? Where are we going to put UDI? Change control is a huge issue. Medical devices have often very long lives with small incremental changes. Is that a significant change? No, I don't mean from a pre-market perspective, but I mean from a end user perspective. Do I need to identify that device differently? And if so, how do I communicate that? So there's a lot of, I think, issues there from a standardization perspective, whether nationally or globally, that there's a lot of opportunity for us to move towards that. And that will, I think, facilitate the broader issues that Lena mentioned, particularly from a global visibility perspective.
And it's important, I think, to remember that standards provide the minimum benchmark for what needs to be done. And if we can get at least the minimum, that minimum benchmark set, then we'll be able to optimize and move forward and progress. But it's a lot of, like we mentioned in the session, Jay talked about each jurisdiction, they have different reasons. Regulators have different reasons for why they want to implement UDI. Ultimately, it's about patient safety. We know that, but there's other reasons. So whether it's counterfeit products or it's for recalls, whether it's internal distribution and traceability. So and each one of those has underlying consequences and needs based on how it's going to be used.
Well, for UDIs to work, they have to be adopted by industry and by healthcare providers who have to be recording them and using that in, for instance, medical incident reports and other things. How is that going? What are the barriers for each group? What are the barriers for industry's adoption, and what are the barriers for healthcare?
That's a couple of day conference in and of itself, but
done.
I think, we should. I think in summary, we again back to standardization and back to consistency. I think the broader healthcare ecosystem has been stymied, maybe reluctant, because it's not. I can't easily do it, right? You go to your grocery store, go to your retail pharmacy. There's a lot of consistency there that allows those organizations to leverage the identifier, leverage the vast amount of data that supports those. We're not quite there yet. Everyone's kind of doing it a little bit different because we don't have standardization. People are meeting the regulatory requirements, and I would agree with that. But it's not consistent enough, right? There isn't that level of consistent application, consistent understanding that really supports the robust downstream use. So we see small instances here and there, but from a broader perspective, even some of the, I would say, what we thought were slam dunks, if you were, distributors in the U.S. are really using UDI. So, back to an issue that you raised before, they're still using their own internal identification numbers. Healthcare facilities still have their own internal identification numbers because they can't necessarily rely, or it's not easy for them to rely on the information that's coming across from a UDI and a UDI data perspective to replace what they have, right? That's a big task.
They have a sunk cost in that,
Exactly.
that current
and
infrastructure.
The challenges for adoption from a healthcare user aspect, obviously it's always resource costs, and that. But then we've got technology. How can a healthcare facility stay up with all the technology that's needed for that, making sure that they understand the need and what's that ultimate purpose for the UDI, but also from a manufacturing perspective, looking at what does the user need in order to be able to use that, instead of being focused on, this is what's easiest for us to make this UDI and to put it onto a package or a labeling, thinking about how that end user is going to use it. One of the big issues is, does the barcode work when it's scanned? So get that barcode verified and understanding the need and the importance of that. Because if we don't build confidence and trust in the user community, the healthcare facilities, in using the UDI, it's not going to be adopted.
Okay.
You said a couple times, you mentioned standardization, and of course there are organizations that are responsible for the standardization of the format of the UDI.
Right.
But AAMI, BSI, and the FDA are very committed to standardization from around medical devices and medical device usage, and especially through ISO and IEC. What kind of standards are needed? What are the key issues that they might address if we were to develop, say, international standards or national standards, either one?
I'm going to take this one first, Jay.
That's fair.
Because I love standards. So UDI, there's two ways of looking at UDI. One is unique device identification, unique device identifier, which is the tool, the number, the barcode. There are all kinds of standards from the issuing agencies, GS1, HIBIC, so on, that create those standards for the tool, that unique device identifier. What we don't have are a real solid set of standards for unique device identification, the process, how do we use it, how do we implement it, how do we standardize it across use so that it's easier for industry to use and adapt. And I think that's where organizations like AAMI and BSI need to focus, is the procedural part, the identification, rather than the identifier itself, because there's already expert organizations that have that taken care of, and so we can just focus on one specific area.
Does this universally apply to all medical devices? Is there a stratification of risk that comes into this? Do I need a UDI on a tongue depressor and a CAT scan?
I think the short answer is yes. Now obviously risk class plays into certain aspects. How much information is available. How is it used, right? You sort of play out the use cases there depending on the risk class of the product. But generally speaking, just as if you go to the grocery store and you don't have a UPC and you try to check out, right, you see the chaos that ensues, right? What is this thing? How do I manage it? How do I identify it? So, the same is true for medical devices. Yes, if I think about a tongue depressor, the risk is probably not that great, but I still need to manage it. I still need them, right? I still need to be able to, in cases of emergency, move them, say, from one place to another. I still need to understand that and still have visibility into that. And so I think it's ubiquitous in terms of our desire, and the same is true of pharmaceutical products, to have that identification that I can use really regardless of the risk class of the product. Other aspects of the UDI system will be different, right, depending on the risk class of the product. But I still need a way of managing that. And I think if you actually ask most people, they'd be shocked to know that UDI doesn't already exist, right? We have such robust systems in almost every other aspect of our life. The pharmaceutical identification scheme has been around since the late 1960s. It's very robust. It underlies everything that we do with pharmaceutical products in the U.S. You go to any retail outlet, you certainly see the benefits of that whole enormous infrastructure. People assume the same thing exists for medical devices. And, there's been, it may not be completely valid, but there's often this point which is it's easier to recall peanut butter than it is to recall most medical devices. And that is a lack of standardized identification and the use of that standardized identifier throughout the life cycle of that product, which is a little scary.
And the worst case scenario, which happened, were implanted devices where there are problems with some of them.
But you can't figure
it
out.
And they're in some people, but you don't know which people the device is.
Exactly.
It's scary to think that the first barcode, the first thing that we saw it on, was a pack of Wrigley's gum,
Right.
chewing gum, and we can't get this on medical devices.
Right.
And it really shows a stark difference between, priorities between the industries and how far we've gone in 50 years, 60 years
Right.
from 1960s to now, and the progress that we haven't made. Why did it take so long? I think also when we talk about the unique device identifier, should a tongue depressor have it? In a perfect world, eventually there won't be part numbers, catalog numbers.
Right.
Everything will have a UDI. And if we can get to that concept, I think that everything would be much easier going forward, because ultimately that's what we're looking at. Right. We may have a J. Crowley, we may have a J. Crowley the second, but J. Crowley the third. But they're different. And in that way, it's its own unique, identifier. And we need to get to that point. And the only way, we need to do that we do it through regulation, but that's only part of it.
Right.
We need the standardization to help support the regulations and provide guidance to users so that it's easier for them to adopt and implement.
Great, exactly.
So I just close with, so what work is going on now? What can people get involved with that might bring some of the same passion you do about the topic to the table?
About UDI? No.
And standards. So yeah, what's the status of the work on this right now, and what's next?
That's an excellent question, because Jay and I have had a number of conversations about some new, what kind of standards do we want to work with, or do we need?
Right.
And in the session today, we got an idea of some of the areas. One of them, probably the biggest one, was labeling, and how can, what kind of standardization is needed around labeling and UDI. We do have ISO TC210. Working Group 2 has ISO 20417, a relatively new standard that we can look at. There's already some aspects of UDI addressed in that standard, but I think it needs to be meted out and really get into its own. There's ISO TC210 Working Group 3, which has ISO 15223 Part 1 on symbols, and there's a symbol in that standard to identify a UDI, because there can be multiple barcodes on a label. I think there's so we need to expand on the standards that are out there, but not muddle the waters. We need to create their own their own specific standards. And Jay and I are working on some ideas and hopefully bringing them to AAMI and BSI for some collaboration, at least
And on to
get it
ISO and
started.
IC.
Yeah.
It's certainly needed. To your question, I think my hope had been that organically, that once the regulation, at least in the U.S. and now, say, in Europe, came into play, that organically there would be this sort of consensus progress made, that it would just happen. But it hasn't, right? And so the lack of sort of venue for that conversation, I think, is what's really limited our ability to progress. There is no place. We talked about subject matter experts earlier. There is no place really for people to come together and go, I'm trying to do this, or to your point about sort of the system feedback, how do I, as an end user, feed information back into this sort of system to provide progress, to get to what I really need in order to make this work. So I think that lack of venue to have that conversation, which I had hoped, again, would happen, I don't know why, magically, organically, I think we need to sort of stoke that fire a little bit through a standards organization to help move this along. I think there's a lot of desire to move it along, or at least I hope there is. At least we are. But it's finding that venue and that right way of doing that. And I think that, as Lena's already mentioned, I think that we have a good opportunity to do that.
Know anywhere we could do all that work?
I think that we
I
probably
think I do.
I want to thank you very much. Lena, you used the term all the progress we haven't made. I think we don't want to underestimate the progress that has been made since, Jay, you
Absolutely.
shepherded the final rule through the FDA and the final rules throughout everything, and the progress you've been doing. It was revolutionary at the time. It's still revolutionary, but it's also moving into the evolutionary stage, and we will continue to make progress. Ultimately, UDIs are going to solve enormous amounts of problems on making sure that we are creating devices that are safe and traceable. So thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time.